My name is Erin, and this is Erin's Audio Corner. And today I have a very special guest. This is Dr. Earl Geddes. Earl, do you prefer I call you Earl or Dr. Geddes?
Earl's fine.
Earl is fine. Okay. All right, cool. And I had asked for those who are curious, how this kind of came about. I was on DIY Audio, and there is a thread there that I dug up about the GedLee Metric. And I've been thinking about, is there a way that I can take, harmonic distortion measurements, IMD type measurements, and make them useful? Because even as a reviewer, I provide harmonic distortion measurements, but frankly, I can't look at it and say, oh yeah, that's definitely an issue. I just kind of go by general guidelines, 3% THD. Okay, maybe that's bad. 10% THD, that's worse than three, but is it audible? Those are the questions that I would really like to have a better understanding of. So I asked Earl if he would be willing to join me and maybe discuss, his research, his findings into nonlinear distortion, and we'll just see where this train ends up. So Earl, if you don't mind, maybe just kind of give a brief intro about yourself, and we'll just kind of go from there.
Okay. Yeah, I started playing with audio probably back when I was very young, 12 years old. I built my first set of loudspeakers. Um, then I just progressed through school, eventually ending up at Penn State to do my PhD in acoustics. I then went back to Ford because I had been working at Ford and worked at Ford for probably another 15 years in the area of acoustics, which involved both audio and noise control, both of which were hot topics at a car company.
Mm-hmm.
We'll get back to that in a minute because that's kind of how I came by the GedLee Metric. Then I went on to work at Knowles, and working on hearing aid transducers. And I did that for several years and then went back to Ford again and back into audio. And then when the whole economy turned down in 2001, I took a buyout and started my own company, consulting, which eventually led to building loudspeakers that I sold for a number of years, but don't do that anymore.
Yeah, unfortunately, I've heard great things about your speakers, but I've never gotten a chance to hear a pair myself.
Yeah, they're not all that common.
Yeah, no, they're definitely not. No, I know just a handful of people who own those, and they've always said great things about them. But
So how I came upon the GedLee metric, um, to explain that, we have to go back a little bit to understanding how the ear functions and how we perceive sounds. And one of the things that I learned very dramatically in acoustics of noise control was that the metrics that were being used, sound pressure level, didn't really correlate very well with people's perception of the sound of the cars. In other words, we were using metrics to evaluate sound levels, but those metrics were not being reflected in people's perceptions. There was a big gap there. And I studied that for a year or two and came to a number of conclusions and wrote a number of internal white papers, etc. I went on to win the Henry Ford Technological Achievement Award for that work, for showing how one should evaluate noise in a car in a different manner that better reflected the way people perceived the sounds. And that was a major change in the automobile industry, where we stopped using dBA as a reference for noise levels because it doesn't correlate very well with perception.
mm-hmm.
Then when I left Ford, I became interested in the same kind of idea of, well, why don't our metrics for nonlinear distortion correlate very well with perception? And I take that back to the mid to late 80s when we did a subtle test on THD and found that crossover distortion in an amplifier, for example, as low as 0.01% could be highly audible. And yet in loudspeakers, we were finding 3 and 5% were just not an issue.
That's interesting.
So there's something clearly wrong there.
Yeah.
And so I started looking at At about that same time, all the talk was about audio compression, MP3, and all the different compression techniques that were being used. And one of the things these compression techniques highlight very well is that there's an awful lot going on in a music source that we don't hear.
Hmm.
So much so to the point where you can take 80% of the data out of the signal and it's imperceptible.
Hmm.
That means that there's a huge amount of data in a signal that just isn't perceptible.
Yeah.
And I started looking at that and found the major rationale behind these these codecs is what the ear does is called masking. Masking is when I have a tone, a sine wave, that masks other tones. In other words, I don't hear the lower level tones in the presence of the higher level one. Well, this interested me a great deal because I thought, well, maybe we don't perceive the harmonics because they're masked by the fundamental. So we started looking at that. My wife Lydia and I started looking at that and created a test whereby we could generate distortions of different character and compare that with how people perceive those distortions on audible listening tests. We found that there was absolutely no correlation between the THD level and what people perceived in those tests. It wasn't there.
Wow.
With IMD, there was a fairly mild correlation, but surprisingly, it was negative. In other words, people seem to prefer higher levels of IMD than lower levels. But again, I wouldn't call that correlation
Okay.
strong enough to be of concern.
Hmm.
So we hypothesized that it was the masking that was causing this, and that if you looked at masking, you would find that the closer the harmonic lies to the fundamental, the less audible it would be. In other words, second harmonic distortion gets heavily masked, third greater, third less, fourth even less. As the harmonics went out in frequency, they would become more and more audible because they become less and less masked.
And when you say that, do you mean, because I'm still, trying to understand and learn and make sure I get my bearings straight. When you're talking
Mhm.
about masking and second order being less perceptible than higher order, is that just because it sounds so similar to the fundamental? And
It's
as you go,
because it's masked. The masking doesn't, in the ear, doesn't even let you hear the second order.
oh wow, okay, okay,
It's just not even there. You can take it away or put it in. It doesn't matter. You can't detect it.
wow, okay,
Third, to a greater extent.
okay,
Um, it turns out that the masking curves widen significantly at higher and higher levels. This means that the higher the SPL level, the greater the masking. So that means that at higher levels, we mask more, so we're less sensitive to THD as far as second, third, etc. goes. The
wow,
harmonics, the
that's
higher
interesting.
harmonics becomes more audible.
Right, okay,
So that was the first realization. Um, and it also meant that we had to look at nonlinearity differently than we were looking at it before, because harmonic distortion just takes and sums up all the harmonics.
hmm,
Um, a better approach would be to uh, weight the harmonics by but way back in the 50s and 60s, people were playing around with the idea of adding 6 dB to each harmonic, and
hmm,
that correlates better with nonlinear distortion. But it's still not a perfect. It's still not as good a correlation as the GedLee metric.
hmm.
One of the things we added to the GedLee metric that is not would not be compensated for by the added 6 dB was the fact that the at very low levels, the masking is very low, which means that as the level goes down, you're able to hear more and more of the harmonics. Well, was kind of interesting because this explained why crossover distortion would be so audible, because it happens at the very lowest levels. In other words,
Hmm.
with crossover distortion, the actual THD content will rise as the level falls. In other words, the harmonics are greater as a percentage, as the level falls.
Hmm.
Well, that explains why the crossover distortion was so audible when in fact second and third harmonic distortion, which aren't significant until the loudspeaker's playing fairly loud, are considered, inaudible. So the GedLee metric adds two things. It adds a frequency component in that it weights the harmonics more by looking at the slope of the line, the slope of the nonlinearity curve, and weighting that greater and greater for lower and lower levels. So those are the two aspects of the GedLee metric that are not present in THD. With the GedLee metric, we got a correlation of about zero point 0.8, zero point 0.9 between the GedLee metric and perception, which was pretty good. So we were happy with that.
Yeah, that's pretty good correlation. So when I hear talk about the correlation between that, at what point is it a problem, and is there research into, because you hear people talk about tubes. Some people like the sound of tube distortion, and I don't have any reference for that. So I'm curious. Did your research touch on that at all, or are you able to
Well,
quantify that?
tubes would have the same characteristic as loudspeakers, and that is they would have much higher orders of distortion at higher levels. So it would tend to be masked. My belief is that people like tubes for some reason or another, and
For
I
other
can't
reasons.
quantify that.
Yeah.
The fact that the THD is higher really is irrelevant because it's all masked.
Okay. Yeah, that's
It's
interesting.
not the THD that matters, in my opinion. It's there's something else that people like in tubes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and it's kind of neat then that what you're saying, it works out because it's almost forgiving of the amp or the speakers, because the distortion, the measured distortion does increase as you increase
Right,
the volume. But what you're saying is, as you increase the volume, the masking effect takes more and more precedent. So you're
right,
getting less and less perception of those distortions, those nonlinearities. So
right.
that's good. That's good for the speakers, and it makes you kind of wonder, have we evolved in some way
Yeah.
for that reason?
Give you a couple examples of where THD would work and where it wouldn't work. If I had a loudspeaker that had, say, 5% THD, and I, through a design, was able to lower that distortion down to 3%. If the harmonic structure didn't change, in other words, the ratios of second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth stayed fairly constant, and the level went down, then you would perceive that as lower level of distortion. However, let's say I had changed the voice coil gap such that instead of falling off gradually at each end, it falls off very rapidly, much like an underhung voice coil where I had the voice coil that was wound pretty much the same height as the gap.
Right.
It's going to run into some fairly hard stops at each end. This is much like clipping in an amplifier, which we know clipping is extremely audible.
Right.
Um, so in that case, the harmonic structure's changed. And even though I lowered the percentage from 5 down to 3 THD, the 3% could easily be perceived as much worse.
Interesting.
So it all comes down to how the harmonic structure is arranged, and none of this is accounted for in THD. You have to have a different approach to accommodate that fact of life.
Okay. And I believe there is some bit of software. Is it Vertins, I believe, that may
Yeah,
introduce?
something there's software out there that does it. I don't remember the name of it, but there's
Yeah.
software out there that will do it. Yeah.
And I wasn't even aware of that until I went to that thread, and I was asking you, is there a way that I can take the existing data that I have and basically use MATLAB to kind of code up a GedLee metric plot? And I think what we had kind of come to decide was that right now I don't have that. So I'm hoping maybe I can get in touch with the folks at Clipple to see if there's something I can do on the back end to get the data, or maybe if they've looked into incorporating your metric, because I know right now they have something called higher order harmonic distortion. And when I was seeing that, I was thinking, well, I wonder how that jives with what Earl has introduced before. It'll be curious to know. So, um, you've worked in IMD and THD. So, and you also touched previously on IMD, and I've heard from some people that IMD is more troublesome. And in my experience, trying to relate those two, I feel like, yeah, that probably is more troublesome. But I'm wondering, then were you able to make a correlation between, or not a correlation, but a comparison between THD and IMD? Is one clearly better or worse than the other, or is that still up for
Well,
grabs?
in actuality, the two are not independent.
Okay,
If you give
right,
me the THD curve with sufficient data, meaning I have the harmonics and the phases, I can calculate what the IMD would be. IMD is and THD are just different signals used to test the same system.
right, right.
Any system with nonlinearity is going to react worse the more components that you send through it.
Hmm.
That's inevitable. So, in
Okay,
other words, IMD, which has two, it's going to be perceived worse than THD. If I have three harmonic or three signals, four, five, the multitone, all of that is going to yield a higher perceptible level because of all the interactions between the signals. So that's why people say it's more perceivable.
okay.
It's
Just
more
because there's more of it.
perceivable because it's more signals
Yeah,
for
more
your
of it.
ear to lock into more cues as to what the nonlinearities are.
Yeah, that makes
And that
sense.
will just continue to go up as I add more and more tones.
Yeah. So, we hear 3%, I mentioned earlier in the intro that 3% is kind of that number that's thrown around. 3% THD is bad. But,
Hmm.
when you actually try to dive into it and learn more about it, well, they say it depends on, the music that you're listening to or whatever the signal is. So I'm curious, do you have, when you look at data, do you have like a hard number, or are you kind of looking at it with the matrix mindset of, okay, I'm looking at these certain things and I'm not looking for a particular number. I'm just looking for trends. Is there some kind of advice you would give, I guess?
Well, given the data we tend to look at these days, as far as nonlinearity goes, there is no number because the data is insufficient, I think, to
Okay.
quantify perception. Um, we did a test of the audibility of nonlinear distortion in compression drivers.
Mhm.
And we had compression drivers up to 20% THD,
Yeah.
and it was indetectable. It was
Yeah.
just not coming out. And that's because it was all low order distortion at very high signal levels.
Yeah, that
And
makes
it
sense.
just wasn't coming out. So if 20% isn't audible, how can 3% be a problem? Again,
Yeah.
it all comes down to what does the harmonic structure look like?
Mhm.
And I don't see people posting the harmonic structure of a nonlinearity. They post a number, a single number, and that doesn't tell you what the structure looks like.
Okay, I got you. So as a reviewer, then I'm wondering, would it be helpful? I mean, if we're trying to get to the point where we can have useful data, because I don't want to provide data just for the sake of providing data. I want to try to, attribute it to something. Hey, this is something you might want to watch out for. Is there
Mhm.
advice you would give? Because right now I've got harmonics, second through fifth order. Would it be useful if I were to provide something out to 10 or 15 or 20, or is that still not really necessarily a good thing?
No, I would want to see the harmonic structure at a low frequency, a mid frequency, and a high frequency,
Okay.
and see what that structure actually looked like.
Okay.
Um, by that I mean you would actually plot out the levels of the harmonics. Fifth, sixth, I think by the time you get to about eight, they better be pretty low.
Yeah. Yeah.
Although I've seen speakers with 11, 12, 13th harmonics. They basically had a rub or a buzz in them,
Okay.
and you'll find those harmonics are way out there.
Well, and that's the next question I was going to ask you, is because, typically when we look at harmonics, um, I'm not able to correlate that necessarily to a mechanical issue. But when I've had like a bad speaker with a voice coil offset or something like that, and you can physically, or you can hear a rub or a buzz, then I'm curious, what data point points to that. And I think for one thing that I don't do right now is only, like I said, I provide second through fifth. But if I were to provide a higher order, then that might be a pointer toward, hey, this is a bad drive unit, or maybe potentially a bad design when it's pushed to this type of limit or something like that.
Yeah, if you're seeing any harmonics above fifth or sixth, that's bad
Yeah.
because those are going to be very audible.
Okay. All right. That's good to know. And you mentioned multitone. Have you done any research as far as multitone goes? Because to me, that's just like that's a dense system of tones. And it's like, all right, what am I looking for here?
Well, I think the idea is that you look at the levels between the harmonics. In other words, you put in multitones and then you look at I guess I would call it the crud that is in the spectrum between the tones.
Okay.
I've never looked at it. I've never tried to correlate that with perception, but I could see where that might work. There might be a correlation there. I think somebody has to do that work, though,
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know
because
who.
I didn't.
I don't know who's going to.
Yeah, I basically started out with the GedLee Metric, trying to quantify um, distortion, and I'll use that in a broad sense.
Hmm.
Why don't loudspeakers sound right to us?
Hmm.
Um, and the more I dug into it, the more I found that it wasn't nonlinear distortion in the loudspeakers that was the issue. Uh, that's when I kind of became uninterested in it, because it wasn't an issue.
Yeah.
That wasn't what we were hearing. What we were hearing was something else. And I now believe that what we hear has more to do with timing aspects, things like non-minimum phase and group delays, than it does with non-linearity, because non-minimum phase and group delay are linear concepts.
Hmm.
So that's not nonlinear distortion. That's perfectly linear. But yet we know the ear has a nonlinear perception. Uh, we we are more sensitive to minimum phase aspects and non-minimum phase aspects and group delay at higher signal levels than we are at lower signal levels.
Interesting.
So that's the exact opposite of nonlinearities.
Yeah.
Now
Yeah.
that adds an interesting aspect to the problem, and that is that if I have a loudspeaker and I'm turning it up and it starts to sound bad,
Hmm.
is that nonlinear distortion? Or maybe that's the fact that the system has non-minimum phase characteristics to it that are becoming audible as the signal goes up. In other words, the system is still linear, but the ear's perception is nonlinear.
Yeah. That's interesting. I hadn't thought
As
about
far
that.
as I can tell, there's no way for a human to detect that. You
Yeah.
would you would think, if you didn't know about the increased perception of group delay with level, you would naturally assume that what you were hearing was nonlinear distortion because it's greater at higher levels.
Well,
But
and because we're all taught that distortion. There's a thing called distortion. To
right,
the layman and even me. I mean, up to a point. I know of distortion. I'm aware vaguely. Of minimum phase occurrences and things like that. Especially when you're talking about the room environment, not necessarily with
mhm,
anechoic measurement. But most people aren't aware of minimum phase issues. So they're just thinking
right,
that's got to be distortion because that's the
right.
only other thing I'm aware of.
It's the only thing I know.
Right.
Therefore, if
That's
all
got to
you
be
have
what
is a
it is.
hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I've got a lot
Um,
of nails around this house, by the way.
yeah,
I got a lot of hammers too. No, that's very interesting. So and that discussion of group delay has come up when I've tested subwoofers. People will often try to attribute a certain value of group delay, to perception of, I don't know, I hate to call it distortion, but I think we're kind of hitting the same stride here is something's not quite right. And they're trying to attribute that to group delay. And I haven't had the time to research it and I don't have the knowledge of that. So I provide that information in hopes that maybe someday somebody will say, I can use this information for good. Um, but how do you define a point? Because to me, like as an analyst, I'm looking for a number. Hey, I need a number to help me relay this information to other people that this is bad and this is good and this is acceptable. This is not. So, are there those things out there, or am I just reaching around in the darkness trying to grasp at straws here?
I don't think the information's out there, but let me clear up a point.
Mhm.
If you look at the general definition of distortion, minimum phase and non-minimum phase, a group delay, are distortions. They
Mhm.
distort the signal. In other words,
Right.
the signal coming out is not the same as the signal going in,
Right.
but they are not nonlinear distortion.
Right.
And there's another confusion that gets thrown around all the time, as people aren't really sure when they're talking about distortion as linear versus distortion as nonlinear.
Mhm.
And you have to be very, very careful about that.
Mhm.
Um, to my knowledge, there has not been a great deal of work done, if any, on the levels of minimum phase that would be audible, or a group delay that would be audible.
Mhm.
One of the papers I point to was a paper that Brian Moore did many, many years ago, looking at group delay in um, bending wave mode transducers because the group delay is fairly high in those transducers.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
He found that, and I quote, at normal listening levels, the group delay is not sufficient to be audible. Well, in that same paper was where I read the phrase that I don't remember the exact words, but he points out that group delay audibility grows with level, and that it's that it's you're most sensitive to it in the 2 or 3 kilohertz region, which we know is a very, very high area of audibility perception in humans. We're
Mhm.
very finely tuned at those frequencies to hear uh, time differences in timing, frequency response, much much more than we are at low frequency.
Hmm.
So I kind of write off the low frequency group delay issue because it's too low in frequency and the group delays are not great enough. If you think about group delay in terms of cycles, 20 milliseconds of group delay at low frequencies is 1, 2 cycles.
Yeah.
At a kilohertz or 3 kilohertz, it's hundreds.
Yeah.
So you've got to be very careful when talking about group delay numbers versus excuse me versus frequency because um, vastly different characteristics with frequency.
Yeah, and I think like when I look at group delay, and I look at phase, I mainly only care about when I'm introducing a new speaker, like a crossover region. That's really
Mhm.
where I care about that kind of information. But otherwise, to me, it's a static number. It's not a dynamic type thing.
Well, it is a static number. The group delay will be constant with level. It doesn't matter what the level is, the group
Hmm.
delay will be the same, unless the frequency response changes as well, which there are some systems, actually, virtually all loudspeakers, the actual frequency response through the crossover changes with level because the driver heats up, the resistors change,
Hmm.
so things detune. I did do some tests on that and found that many loudspeakers have dramatic frequency response changes through the crossover region as they heat up.
Yeah,
And I
I
went
noticed
out of
that.
my way to design the speakers I had so that that didn't happen.
Yeah, and well, and so that's along the lines of compression and enhancements, like
Yes.
frequency response linearity. Yeah, and I've started trying to implement some of that testing again, because I feel like it's a fact. To me, I feel like compression is more of a concern than distortion. I'm not really concerned with trying to figure out distortion as much as compression is a frequency response. It's a
Hmm.
nonlinear thing that occurs to a linear,
System.
linear distortion. Yeah, so it's kind of a weird area for me, but I feel like that's the area that I should focus my attention to, and I would prefer that others would do the same too because I feel like that's more audible.
Yeah. Well, I would agree with that. It's certainly, in my opinion, more audible than THD. And we generally don't see frequency response tests on a cold loudspeaker versus a warm loudspeaker at high levels.
Right.
That would be an interesting test.
Yeah,
Very interesting.
that would be. And we like one set of tests that I've started running is I feel like I'm bragging on myself. I'm really not. I'm just trying to run some things by you to see if these make sense as because again, as a reviewer, I want to provide good information that's useful instead of just providing a bunch of pretty plots, right? Um,
Hmm.
so one of the things that I've started doing is I test at 76 dB at 1 meter, and then I ramp that up to 86, 96, and then 102 if the speaker can handle that. And I want to see what the response is doing. If I expect 10 dB of gain, am I getting that? And I'm finding a lot of cases I'm not getting that. Certainly power speakers where they're, using limiters,
Hmm.
but even passive speakers, I'm not getting that. And what's really interesting to me is how the deviation, it doesn't follow like there's no specific kind of curve or trend. It can just be all over the place,
Yeah, can
it,
be.
yeah.
When you do your tests, how long is the signal duration?
It's
Fairly
just
short.
quick. So that's a quick sweep, and that's
Yeah.
something else I was curious about if you had input on because there's a couple different things that I'm curious about. One is long-term listening, compression for long-term listening, which is I used to do that testing, but that takes a long time and I have to be outdoors. But the other thing is just doing like a quick anechoic type sweep, and I'm trying to picture and rationalize those in my head as the quick sweep might be more a test for dynamics, like instantaneous dynamics,
Right.
maybe as instead of long-term testing for compression would be, just long-term listening and what's
Yeah,
going on there.
I would do a test at a level that was below uh, what would destroy the loudspeaker,
Hmm.
but I would run a frequency response, then let it continue to run for a minute, run it again, run for another minute, because thermal is very slow, very very slow.
Yeah.
It takes many minutes for a loudspeaker to heat up to its operating temperature,
Hmm.
and by that time, things could change dramatically. And that's the test I did. That I don't know if anybody has done a similar test, because
Yeah.
after a minute or two, one of these loudspeakers we tested, the crossover had completely changed and the frequency response was awful.
Yeah.
If you let it cool off, it would come back to being just exactly what they advertised.
Yeah.
Who listens that way? I mean,
No, you're
I
right.
use my speakers now more for movies, and that's 2 hours,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
sometimes 2 hours of very high level signals. You're watching a war movie or something. It's a lot
Right.
of signal, and by the end of that movie, your loudspeakers could be completely detuned.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I mean, I know one of my older tests that I used to run was using Klippel's M-Ton um, module, and it was multi-tone, and it would run for, you can set it up to be whatever you want, but I would set it up for 2 minutes, and then, or it would be 60 seconds of stimulus, and then it would measure the response and then cool off for 2 minutes, and then it would just increment the voltage output like by 1 volt or whatever you set it to, and that would tell you kind of what the compression was doing as the speaker was getting warmer and warmer. But as I mentioned, I've since abandoned that. So what I like what you're saying is I could implement something like that where I could run a frequency response at a particular level, say maybe 86 dB at 1 meter, something just to get a good range on it. Hit it with some pink noise or something like that for a little while, and then measure it again, something like that.
You could actually just continuously record the data and then go and look at chunks
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, just let it
later
run for a
on.
long time.
That wouldn't really be necessary. I guess you could just grab some data and then let it run. A minute later, grab some more data.
Yeah, yeah, that's
I,
a good
I
idea.
suppose you'd want to heat it, so you would want to use a signal other than a swept tone.
Right, give it a
So
broadband
yeah,
signal.
you probably want to you know do a swept tone, run a signal through it for a minute, do another sweep tone, another minute, sweep tone. I think you'd find significant differences, especially between very small loudspeakers, the modern, you know, 5-inch woofer and one
Yeah,
inch tweeter. That's the speaker that we found that after 2 or 3 minutes, the frequency response had completely destroyed,
man.
because those little speakers just cannot handle those kind of temperatures.
I hope you don't mind. I'm kind of picking your brain here because, as
No,
I
that's
said, I'm
fine.
I'm trying to
That's what
improve
we're here
what I'm
for.
doing as well. So yeah, yeah, I certainly appreciate your time. I didn't say that opening up, excuse me, but I do appreciate your time, and this is pretty cool. I'm excited to talk to you. So
Well, I'd like to see people doing better measurements of loudspeakers. Maybe we could sort out this irrational viewpoints that exist out there on loudspeakers and what the measurements mean.
yeah, well, and you mentioned earlier, and I actually, and honestly, I took a cue from you. It was probably about 8 or so years ago. I've been testing drive units for a while, and I was concerned about nonlinearity because everybody is concerned about distortion, and I kept seeing, the more I would test stuff, the less I would be able to rely, subjectively on the distortion, but certainly the frequency response, the linear distortion. That was always the main hitter. So I got to the point where I'm like, why am I even bothering spending all this time doing all this abuse testing, if you will, of these speakers to
Hmm.
provide high output distortion data when it's really all like it's right there in the frequency response?
Yeah, it mostly is, and of course, people like Floyd Toole, he doesn't. They don't even measure THD, or they don't even measure nonlinearity in loudspeakers. It just isn't a factor to them, which I think is a little one area that I am not in complete agreement with the Harman people on, is that they don't seem to think that there is a sound character that breaks down at higher levels. And that's
Hmm.
something I do believe is true. I mean, my experience is that loudspeakers at higher levels lose it,
Hmm.
to for lack of a better word, at dramatically different places and in dramatically different ways. And that has got to be something more than frequency response. I
Yeah.
think changes in frequency response are part of it, but I also think it has to do with other factors like um, group delay and the ability to perceive group delay. We did a test where we deliberately added in group delay type of internal reflections such that would occur in a horn loudspeaker.
Hmm.
And we definitely found that as the SPL level went up, the perception went up too as well. Even though the system was not changing, the group delays, etc., were all the same. We were just playing back the signals at higher levels, and we found a statistically significant correlation between perception and level. Now, one of the things I will point out is that because this test that we did was done at a public university by my wife Lydia, uh, there were legal implications as to how high a level we could test.
Okay.
Because if you want to test somebody at levels up and around above about 90 dB, then OSHA gets involved, and OSHA would then have required a dramatically different set of protocols for us. So it just wasn't feasible. And we never tested above about 85 dB. And we found even at 85 dB, there was a statistically significant audible effect from group delay.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the assumption then is if you kept going, it would have
Oh
grown and
yeah,
grown and
it would.
grown.
There's no doubt in my mind it would have kept going higher and might
Yeah.
even grown at an even greater rate.
Wow. So, and when you're talking about group delay, I mean, are we talking about like all frequencies or particularly like the crossover region or?
Well, that's where things get problematic because um, loudspeakers generally won't have much group delay, except a badly designed crossover could have a lot of group delay between the two up the low section and high section.
Mhm.
Um, but a lot of people go out of their way then to correct that group delay, and I think there's some evidence to say that that's perceptible. But where I found the most significant aspects of group delay happen because of diffraction.
Okay, that's interesting.
Because diffraction has to have group delay simply because the diffracted signal is delayed from the original signal. You
Right.
can't have zero group delay when you have two signals arriving at two different times.
Hmm.
That's another term for that is multipath.
Hmm.
Um, so I became concerned with diffraction and have gone to extremes to minimize diffraction both in my loudspeakers and in my room, which amazes me how people pay no attention to the room and the artifacts around the loudspeakers that are all diffractors.
Hmm.
My loudspeakers sit away from everything. There's nothing around them. There's no TV screen in the middle. There's no equipment in the middle. There's nothing. There's nothing around to diffract the signals. And the speakers themselves have rounded corners on the edges and minimum diffraction in the waveguide.
Hmm.
And I have found that this is amazingly effective at imaging and characteristics that I look for in loudspeakers, imaging
Yeah.
being one of the stronger ones.
Right.
And there's just no discussion of that at all. So when I talk about group delay, most of it's probably coming from the room and not the loudspeaker, although
Okay.
much of it can come from the loudspeaker. There's no reason why not. Old diffraction type horns had a lot of group delay because
Yeah.
the diffraction slot acted as a secondary source. And so you had the compression driver as one source, and then the diffraction slot as a secondary source. So that audible group delay, and of course, in my opinion, or from my experience, when you take those diffraction horns and you start to turn them up, they start to sound really nasty.
Yeah.
And I think it's because of that group delay effect. My waveguides have no diffraction or minimum diffraction in them, and I can turn them way up, and I never ever get that harshness.
Yeah, yeah, I could see that. Well, and so talking about your product and high sensitivity speakers in general, the one thing that I've noticed is if you have a high sensitivity speaker, or maybe just a speaker that doesn't have a lot of thermal issues, it's harder for you to notice. Like normally, when you have a high distortion speaker, or I say high distortion, just a speaker that starts a thermal, you can turn it up, and then you start to know, like it starts to feel loud, and you think, okay, I need to turn it down. But with high sensitivity speakers, I've noticed that you can turn them up to louder than normal levels and not realize it's that loud, because you're not getting those characteristics or those indicators that, hey, this is loud.
Hmm.
And I just wonder, I'm kind of curious, is there if there's been any research into that
Well, I'll tell you one
correlation?
thing we did back when I was in a car company, and that was that we found that if you didn't make an audio system that distorted as you turned it up, people would think it didn't play loud enough.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. That is very, very interesting. It's kind of like we become, adept to expecting some sort of
Yes,
distortion as we increase the volume.
it's expectation.
Yeah.
If my system doesn't distort when I turn it on full volume, then it's not loud enough.
Yeah.
It's not
And that
playing
can
very
actually,
loud.
and I could see that being a concern from, Ford Motor Company, because
Right.
somebody's going to go deaf, someone
We could have designed
hearing
amplifiers
damage.
that had zero distortion as you turn them up, but then we
Yeah.
found customers didn't like that.
That's very
So,
interesting. Yeah. But yet here we are as audiophiles. We're like, we want zero distortion. Turns out maybe we do want
mhm.
some kind of distortion, as at least as an indicator that we've reached loud, if you want
Yeah.
to call it that.
Or if you want a system that never sounds harsh, even as it turns up, I mean, you can design that as well if that's
Yeah.
what you're looking for. In cars, obviously, that's not what customers were looking for. So,
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned, the car stuff, and I gotta give you a personal thank you while I'm here talking to you on the fact that I think it was around 2008 or so, I had stumbled onto I've actually got the paper up. It's the localized sound power method.
mm,
Do you remember that?
yeah,
And it says that you wrote it, I guess, when you were working at Ford for them back
yeah,
then.
yeah.
And it's been a while since I've read it. I just kind of breezed through it again, but I think that is what taught me the importance of a true spatial average. Instead of taking a single microphone measurement and trying to base equalization on that, you get a spatial average. And I think you
Mhm.
stated in this paper that you were looking at up to 18 different measurement points, and you wound up realizing that six would be adequate.
Mm,
I think
right.
trend line probably fell off around that point. Yeah, so I think that's really cool, and I really think that without that, I don't know that people will be doing the whole, moving microphone thing where they wave it in front of their face. I don't think we would understand the importance of a good spatial average.
Well, virtually all car companies these days use that technique.
Yeah. Well,
It's
and
it's it's
it's
essential
interesting
in
too.
cars.
Well, you see more and more people. Like I'm involved in aftermarket car audio. I mean, that's where my passion is. That's where it started. And when I started out, it was just measuring with an RTA with one mic, and then it was measuring at different points and averaging them together via Room
Mhm.
EQ Wizard. And then it developed into waving the microphone in front of your face. Now, Mini DSP. I don't know if you've seen it. They've got the U Mic X, which is an arrayed microphone in a square or a
Hmm.
rectangle type pattern, and it does all the averaging instantaneously, and you can link up to four of those devices together for 16 channels of averaging in real time. So that's
Hmm.
neat. Then you've got people who are running programs like Smart,
Right.
Systune, where they're doing averaging of multiple microphones at the same time. So I
I
think
hope
that's
they're
pretty
doing
neat.
that. I hope they're doing that averaging correctly because you do not average the electrical signal.
Yeah.
You have to average the spectrum.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so I can't speak on that because I don't have any experience with it, but I do know that people are out there using it, and I know a couple of people in aftermarket or in the car industry who are on the audio side who use these kind of tools for their tuning of their systems in the luxury brands.
And in fact, you average the dB levels, not the linear levels, because the statistics were all done in dB.
Hmm.
So the statistics I quote in that paper, those are all in dB. So you have to do the averaging in dB,
Mhm.
and then it corresponds to what that paper talks about.
Okay. Yeah.
But I've seen people doing averaging, like when you sweep the microphone in front of your face, that's time averaging. That's not exactly the same as what we did.
Yeah. And
Not
you'd put a microphone in a place in different places and then
right.
average them together. So that's what I started out doing. But then the lazier side of me took over, and I was like, I'm just going to use
Well,
a microphone.
it's a matter of of number of points. If
Mhm.
I can do 6 points average spectrally, it would probably require, much greater number of points to do it temporally.
Mhm. Okay.
You could still get a good average, a good number, or a reliable number by averaging the actual time signal, but it would just take a lot more signal.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm curious now. Have you ever messed with binaural mics for any of this?
Yeah, I did. A while back, I had an idea that since uh, it was impractical to sell my speakers through um, dealers because that would just driven the price through the roof.
Right.
So I never did that. And I thought, well, how can I get people to audition the speakers? And I always invited people to come over and listen to them at my house. That was fine. And people still do that sometimes. Um, so I thought, well, maybe I could binaurally record them and then post those binaural recordings. And so I did that. But when I played back the binaural recordings and I listened to them, they were just very disappointing. And I felt that my disappointment with the recordings would be reflected by other people's disappointment in the loudspeakers, thinking
Yeah.
that the bad recordings were caused by the loudspeakers, which, in my opinion, wasn't the case. So I kind of dropped that and didn't pursue it. There
Yeah.
are ways you can do that, I believe, but I didn't get in deep enough to it.
Yeah.
You have to standardize on the headphones is one of the things. You can't allow a customer to use any headphones if you're trying that because the to do proper binaural recordings, you have to know what the playback headphones are.
Right. Yeah. And you got to hope that if you tell everybody to buy the same headphone, the quality control is good enough to where it's expected. You can determine what they're going to get based on
Yeah,
that headphone's
and at
response.
that time the headphones were very expensive. The Lambda something or other, they were electrostatic headphones.
Oh, okay.
Then there were thousands of dollars a piece. So now I knew that if you had those headphones, you could get very realistic playbacks because we were already doing that in cars. We were documenting the sound quality of cars using
Okay.
binaural recordings, but we were using the full head system with the head playback system and everything, and
Mhm.
those were very good.
Yeah. Are you talking about the hats, the B&K hats type thing with the head and
No,
torso?
head acoustics.
Oh,
H
I don't think I'm familiar.
HEAD, Head Acoustics in Aachen,
Okay.
Germany. Well, they were the people that started this whole binaural thing, and we found it. Uh, I found this through noise control because the head acoustic system was developed by Klaus Janowitz, and he developed that in conjunction with Mercedes Benz.
Oh, okay.
And Mercedes Benz did it because they wanted to bring sound quality evaluations into the laboratory. And so he was hired to develop that technology, which resulted in his binaural recording technology, which, as far as I know, is still the best
Mhm.
available. And when I was invited to go to Mercedes to view their noise control labs, I met Klaus, and that's he. We talked about binaural recording and how to use binaural recording to enhance the correlation between perception and what we were measuring.
Mhm.
And I brought that into Ford Motor Company, and then we started using it for audio systems, and it worked very well there. But when I tried it at home, it didn't work for me. But I didn't have the right playback system. That was the problem. I had the recording system, but not the playback.
Okay.
And so it became obvious that if you couldn't control the playback, you couldn't control the customer
Yeah,
perception.
yeah, that makes sense, that makes sense. What I tried to do, I can't remember the Zoom, I think is the company. They make a little Sonic. I think it's 2 or 300 bucks, little doohickey, and it will
Hmm.
record in all sorts of modes. And one mode I would try to do was binaural because I thought that would be cool. Kind of like what you were saying was if I can review a speaker objectively and then I can provide you with the sense of what I actually heard in my room, that would be great, right? I mean, how cool would that be? But then I want
Hmm.
to drop it because I ran into the same issues that you did. I mean, how can I control to make sure that everybody's
Right.
going to be listening to the way I intend them to listen to? Otherwise, it's pointless.
If you do it in a lab, it's fine. And I know for a fact that Harman does this in the lab.
Hmm.
They do a lot of binaural recording in the lab, but they have complete control over the playback. But they've never, for obvious reasons that we're talking about, they've never released that to the consumer level.
Yeah. Well, are you aware of what Crutchfield is doing with this?
No.
So they have, and I haven't looked at it in a while now, so I may be kind of fumbling through it, but they have, I think it's like their speaker comparator, and you can go and you can select a couple different speakers and you can play them back because they're supposed to be recorded binaurally or something like that. Maybe they take the impulse response and they convert it and convolve it and do all sorts of stuff. But you can then go in and say, all right, Crutchfield, I'm listening through these headphones. And then it has the built in HRTF, I believe, into a headphone
Hmm.
response adapted for what you're going to use. The idea is that you're supposed to be able to listen and directly compare speakers as if you were sitting in whatever room this would be in. And I find that very interesting. And I haven't tried it myself actually, but
I would think that comparatively speaking, that's going to work a whole lot better than in an absolute case. In other
mhm,
words, if you and I record a loudspeaker and we want somebody to play that back and listen to it and judge whether that's a good or bad loudspeaker, well, there's no comparison there. So that can be very misleading. But
mhm.
if I recorded 10 different loudspeakers, all under identical circumstances, and you played them back all under the same circumstances, the comparative rating there would probably be pretty close to what you would evaluate in real life.
Yeah, I could see
But
that.
you would be hard pressed to compare any of those loudspeakers to anything that you perceived in the real world because
Yeah.
that comparison isn't going to be there.
Yeah. Well, and I also wonder about like with headphones, I always have that head in a box feeling. I've yet to hear a good set
Yeah.
of headphones that transport
Well,
you there, you know?
if you have a good playback system, for instance, the head acoustics does not have that. There
Okay.
is no head in the box in their system because they take that out with the playback control. So
Interesting.
that can be removed.
Yeah.
And literally, you with a head acoustic system, and I'm not advertising for head acoustics, but
That's fun.
their system is very good. Um, they have a demo tape where a guy rattles keys as he walks around you,
Uh-huh.
and you can hear him behind you. I mean, you swear he is behind you.
That's
That
crazy.
is very hard to do.
That's crazy.
Very, very
Yeah,
hard.
I've listened to like I'm not a headphone aficionado, but I've gotten to hear some really expensive ones, and you assume with price comes, fidelity. Generally,
Mhm.
hopefully, but I've yet to hear a headphone that really moved me like a good set of loudspeakers does, and maybe that's just me. I know there's a
Yeah,
lot of headphone
well,
people out there.
I'm the same way. The headphones have their place, but they're lacking compared to a good
Yeah,
loud.
they just don't have that that sense of space that a good set of speakers and a
Right,
good recording
right.
can provide that I've
And
experienced.
that head and the vice stuff drives me crazy as well.
Yeah, I'm just like, oh, it's somebody says, "Oh, the soundstage is so deep," and I'm like, "I think it's like to the tip of my nose, man.
Yeah,
It's not deep to me." Or the
yeah.
soundstage is to my ears. That's about as wide as it gets.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's very. I don't know. It's kind of funny. Um, there was something else I was going to ask you, but I've kind of forgotten. So let me pull up my email real fast. And I don't know what time how much time you've got, but I don't want to take up too much of your time. Um,
Oh, didn't realize it's gone that long.
yeah,
But no, I'm fine.
that's what audio does. Um, you're familiar with tools work in the spin data and all of the
Yeah,
Harman efforts that they've done.
right.
I don't want to say blanketly how do you feel about it, but I guess for a lack of better words, what are your thoughts on spin data and how that correlates? Have you followed that pretty closely, and do you have
Um,
opinions on that?
well, it's absolutely the right thing to do.
Hmm.
Let me just say that the data they take is absolutely the right data to take. I have a little bit of a problem with the way they analyze that data,
Hmm.
and that is because if you ask how and why do they weight the different curves, it comes out that they did that by going to a number of recording studios and measuring the reflection patterns in those recording studios.
Mm,
And that's what they used as those numbers. Well, now you've made huge assumptions about the room,
right,
and we don't all have the same rooms.
right,
So,
right.
so is that going to hold up in a different room? For instance, in my room, I go out. I go to great lengths to control the ceiling and floor reflections because I
Mm,
don't want them. And I
yeah.
accentuate the horizontal reflections because I do want those. That
Interesting.
is not going to come out in their data. Their
Yeah.
data has a lot of vertical reflections that don't exist in my system.
Mm,
So that's where I have a problem. So absolutely, they take the right data. You have to take their analysis not with a grain of salt, but you have to understand that their analysis is not broadly applicable to every situation.
okay. And are you talking about like in terms of the preference score, or you talking
I'm
about like
talking
the
about
way the
in
feature
terms of
curves?
they show a DI,
Yes.
a
Right.
listening window DI, etc.
Right.
Um, yeah, well, that listening window DI comes from data that they took in these particular recording studios.
Right.
That DI is not going to be the same DI that I would see in my room, for
Right.
example.
Right. Right.
So I have to take that. So I absolutely look at the curves that they show for on axis and DI.
Hmm.
Those two to me are the most important.
Yeah.
The other ones are derived from those that same data, but they're derived on the assumption of a specific set of rooms.
Right, right. Okay, I know what you're saying. So, and I'm actually kind of the same way whenever I do these reviews and to kind of throw them up on YouTube so I don't sit there and linger on a CEA 2034 plot forever. I usually just hit the highlights, which to me are I talk about on axis and then I talk about the DI because I say, that kind of gives you an idea of where there's going to be discontinuities and crossover region and resonances like port resonances, which I see all the time.
Mhm.
But that's a different conversation altogether. But I will say that their prediction model lines up pretty darn well above about 4, 5, 600 hertz as you would expect from a room,
Mhm.
all the way out to about 10 kilohertz. And then 10 kilohertz, there's usually about a 2 or 3 dB deviation, but for the most part, it's within 1 or 2 dB. So I've been really surprised at how well that models in my living room. But in my theater room, which is completely different animal, I've got all sorts of sound absorption on the side, and my front walls covered in sound absorption because it's an acoustically transparent screen. Things are
Right.
different there, and it doesn't track as well.
Right.
Um,
Well,
but yeah,
that's
so I
pretty
get
much
what you're
what I
saying.
was saying.
Yeah, and I really find it interesting what you're talking about. So I prefer, I don't know if I want to say prefer. I tend to find that when I get speakers in for review, that I prefer speakers that have a wider radiation pattern because there's more sidewall involvement. And I prefer that apparent source width that it provides you. But I don't feel like there's enough, at least from my understanding, there's enough discussion out there as far as what happens vertically. So you mentioning that you have absorption panels or absorption, I'm assuming on the ceiling.
Diffusers. I have
Okay,
diffusers on the
diffusers.
floor, on the ceiling, and absorption on the floor.
Okay, okay. And do you have any kind of thoughts as far as, the difference between vertical? How does that really affect, the timbre of the sound as opposed to horizontal?
Some real experts, Dave Griesinger, for example, claims that reflections in the vertical plane have no bearing on your perception. I don't know that that's
Interesting.
necessarily true, but that's one data point.
Hmm.
Um, I don't see where any vertical reflections could be beneficial.
Okay.
Horizontal reflections, we know those are beneficial. Those add
Hmm.
spaciousness. But there's also a problem with horizontal if they come in too close.
Hmm.
Uh, One of my pet peeves is that when we discuss audio, we never seem to discuss the difference between the two predominant venue types that exist in recordings. One venue type is when I go into an auditorium with a binaural microphones or a number of microphones, and I'm trying to recreate that sonic image in
Hmm.
my home.
Right.
That's one
Okay.
type of venue. The
Hmm.
other is I go into a recording studio and I record these musicians and I play it back on my playback loudspeakers, and I adjust it to where I get what I'm looking for. Those two things are completely different, and in fact, they tend to want different aspects. For instance, if I'm trying to recreate the hall, I probably want a loudspeaker with a very low DI so that it interacts with the room and the room spaciousness will help to fill in the spaciousness that's lacking in the recording.
Yeah. Okay.
Because it's difficult to get spaciousness from loudspeakers that are coming directly at you because that's not what spaciousness is.
Right.
Spaciousness is the perception of sound arriving from different directions.
Hmm.
So you have to have different arrivals, which is where multi-channel comes in, etc. I'm not against multi-channel, but let's face it, after 20, 30, 40 years, multi-channel is just never taken off. It's never going to
No,
be the medium.
I don't
The
see it.
medium is stereo, and
Yeah.
it's always going to be stereo. Let's face it, it hasn't changed. No matter how hard people try and add in multi-channel, it just doesn't change the marketplace.
Hmm.
So I concentrate on two-channel. And how do you get the best performance out of two-channel? Well, that's different. And I like studio work. I'm trying to enhance image. I want the image. I want to feel that those musicians are in the room with me, not me in another room. Those are different, and you're gonna want different criteria in your loudspeakers. For example, if I have a wide loudspeaker, a low DI loudspeaker, and a reverberant room, then I'm going to get uh, a lot of very early reflections.
Yeah.
These very early reflections are going to add to your perception of spaciousness, but they're going to degrade your perception of image.
Okay. Yeah, I can see
So
that.
what happens is that if I'm looking for spaciousness is my major criteria, I'm going to like a low DI loudspeaker. If imaging is my criteria, I'm going to want a high DI loudspeaker.
Yeah.
Where in this discussion or any discussion of loudspeakers do anybody differentiate these two things? Because
Yeah.
they go in opposite directions.
Right. No, that they totally do. And that's actually, I'm glad you mentioned that because that's a question that I've wondered. As a reviewer, I talk about these things and I say, for me, it kind of comes down to what I have learned that I prefer based on seeing the data after the fact. And I'm curious, can anybody define a perfect speaker? I don't think that there ever is a perfect
No.
speaker. Yeah.
If you could define the source, I could define that loudspeaker. But
Hmm.
if you can't define that source, then there's no answer.
Right, right. Yeah. Then I think you also get involved in what you mentioned before, about the room interaction and the preference. And I kind of have a thing where I consider preference versus reference because, you may have a perfectly flat on axis response and some people may not prefer that. Some people may like
Mhm.
something else. But then you get into the whole thing about the radiation pattern of the speaker. Is it completely omnidirectional? And do you like that? Or do you want one that's got a beam pointed, I mean, the complete opposite where a beam is pointed right down at you? Do you like that? I mean, those are two extremes, but there's so much in between those 2 points.
Right,
And then
right.
trying to figure out what works best for you and what do you like?
Well, we know there's a relationship between DI and um, uh, high frequency sound level. For example, if I have a speaker with a flat DI, one that does not beam, then this speaker is sending high frequencies all over the room, and they then through reverberation arrive at my ear. And I will perceive that as fairly high level of high frequencies, as compared to a beaming tweeter, very common in loudspeakers,
Right.
that's beaming the sound right at you. There is no enhancement of the sound from the reverberation. So in that case, I want a higher level of high frequencies than I want in the case of the high DI, the want in the case of the flat DI,
Right. Right.
uh,
Yeah. To
because
make
that's
up
going
for
to
it.
have more room reverberation, and that's going to enhance the high frequencies.
Right.
So again, the desire for flatness of high frequency response weighs very heavily with the DI. And
Yeah.
again, that's hardly ever talked about.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I mean, and there's another thing too about, speakers with radiation patterns that are just kind of shifting all over the place. So
Right,
yeah, I've tested a few where it's not just in the crossover, it's due to, other issues. The speaker is starting to, have resonances or breakups, the port resonating and things like that. So,
right,
and that always does a number because I hear people talk about, I like a particular sound, but when you have a speaker that may be wide at 1 kilohertz and then, say 90 degrees plus or minus 90 degrees at 1 kilohertz, but then at 1.2 kilohertz, it's got to suck out somewhere. So it's 30 degrees wide. Well, what does
hmm
that do to your sound stage? And I kind of attribute that some cases to people will talk about a forward sound. And I know that can be found in frequency response, but I have to think that there's something to be said for the radiation characteristics of a speaker that can intimate the quote forward sound or a laid back sound or something like that too. But I have yet to get a grasp on how to relate that to people, you know? I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
Well, I think for many, many, many years, the polar response of loudspeakers was ignored,
yeah,
and it's critical.
yeah,
So we've been ignoring a critical aspect for a very long time.
right.
And I think that I give Floyd Toole and Sean Olive a lot of credit for um, Spinorama because they recognized that as well, and they went about adding that into the industry.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's important information to have, especially when you're able to understand and relate to. If I put a speaker in a room, you know, in the center of the room,
Right.
and its radiation pattern is this, looking from a bird's eye view, then you can kind of envision what the interaction with the room is going to be. But it's just been my experience, that speakers with varying radiation patterns do a lot of things, a lot of weird things to the soundstage that some people may like. But I think that when you have another reference that's not like that, then you understand that it's not necessarily a good thing.
Right. One of the other aspects of evaluating loudspeakers, of course, is expectation.
Yeah.
We often find loudspeakers that don't sound like the ones we have as lacking. Uh,
Yeah. That's true.
and in fact, loudspeakers that measure very good are often perceived by loudspeakers as being dull, but evaluated as being dull
Mm-hmm.
because they don't have these aspects that they hang their hat on. They're
Right.
gone.
Well, it's kind of like conditioning too. Like
Right.
you've grown accustomed to hearing this sound and you're expecting that sound because in your head, that sound that you have is the bee's knees. That's what everything should try to be.
Yeah, unless you've got a lot of experience with very good loudspeakers, you're going to be biased by the experiences you've had.
Yeah, I believe, and that's kind of a thing too about nostalgia really plays
Oh
into.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like nostalgia when I've tested certain speakers, which I'm not going to get into. They have a very strong following because of the
Hmm.
nostalgic factor. They've had
Right.
multiple iterations for the last 30 or 40 years. And even
Right.
though they're garbage, at least objectively, people still love them. And if you tell them they're not an accurate speaker, those people will really get upset with you. So,
And can't get over the fact of the nostalgia that comes from the music, the source. If
absolutely.
if you're listening to some loudspeakers and a song comes on that brought to mind your first love,
Hmm.
you're going to love those loudspeakers.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah,
Right? I
because I
mean,
mean,
because they why? Because you feel great. It
yeah, it's
made
like
you feel
this is
great.
work.
It was completely irrelevant what the loudspeakers
Yeah,
were, but you
yeah.
feel great.
Yeah. Well, I talked to a couple of my buddies about this last week, about passive versus active listening. And it's a question my brother had asked me. He knows that I'm into music. And he said he coined it a different way, but basically it comes down to, are you listening just the music, just kind of passively, like just kind of going through the emotions? Are you actively listening to what, the lyrics are, what the artist is actually
Mhm.
saying? And for the most part, I would consider myself a passive listener. I'm just kind of flowing through the moment. I've got music on everywhere at all points
Mhm.
in time. Um, but I think that kind of goes a lot back toward the nostalgia. I mean, dude, I could be happy just riding the stock radio in a car, and as long as it's a good jam, I'm
Right,
going to enjoy
right,
the system.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I'm the opposite. I don't listen to music passively, and in fact, I find music a distraction if it's on all the time. I
really.
can't
Okay.
think. I listen to the music,
Yeah, I
and
got
I
you.
can't think. I can't do my work. If I'm trying to study something or I'm intensely trying to develop some code or something, if I have music on, I can't do it because I'm always listening to the music.
Yeah.
And so when I put music on, I don't do anything else. I
Okay.
just sit and listen to the music. So that is definitely not passive.
Yeah. No, that's
And,
that's
and, and I have found that I will approach music listening differently than people who listen passively. It might
yeah.
even have a strong effect on preference.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like going out of your way. I'm going to dedicate
Right.
this time to listen to
Right.
music.
I'm going to dedicate this time to listening to this musical passage.
Yeah.
And I find it annoying if I'm listening with other people and they want to talk. Sorry, but that's not why I'm here.
Yeah. Yeah. I get you. Well, it's so funny, man. I'm the same way. At least if I'm listening to music, I want to just kind of listen to music because that's like the only time I get to listen to it. So it's ironically the only time I really get to listen to music is when I'm reviewing somebody's speakers, you know? But I
Yeah.
don't get to listen to my own system anymore because I just don't have, I've got a wife, kid, work, a job, that whole thing, maybe one day I'll have time to just sit and actively listen, but I don't know.
Yeah, when
For
you
me,
retire.
yeah, yeah. One of these days I'll get to do that. I don't know what that's like, but I'm looking forward to it. Um, but yeah, I mean, if a song comes on the radio, I mean, it's just amazing. It takes you back like that, and that's
Yes.
the reason why I'm here, and I think
Yeah,
that certainly for you is probably the same reason. We love music first.
exactly. And you know, well, that's exactly what happens. I can be studying if the music's on and a song that I always loved comes on. I cannot not stop and listen to that song. It's
I
just
know.
impossible.
Well, I know people that will fall asleep listening to the radio, and I
Yeah,
can't
I
do
could
that
never
because
do
I
that.
start singing in my head. I'm like singing
Yeah,
lyrics. I'm up till
yeah.
3 a.m.
No way. Yeah, I always like falling asleep to random noise, pink
Yeah,
noise, or
that's what I do.
ocean waves, or something like that.
Yeah,
Not
yeah.
music.
Yeah, we've got a noise generator. It started off as a
Yeah,
fan 10 years ago. Now we've got a noise generator. And matter of fact, when
right.
our power went out a couple years ago, I have a noise generator app on my phone that I just set it down next to my bed and play pink noise of all things. So
It's proven to be very effective.
yeah, yeah,
It's
that's
not
pretty
a
cool.
not an unknown thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Very effective.
I'll just thank you once again for your time. I'll end it here and
Sure.
I'll ask anybody who has any questions to leave them below, and I will try to direct them toward DIY audio if they have any questions specifically for you or your website. I'll link that below as well. So thanks
Okay,
again for joining
great.
me. It was great, man. I really
All
appreciate it.
right. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, have a good one.
All right. Bye bye.
All right, bye.